want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. Today's video is just going to be me rambling about my first day impressions after playing one basically full day of the set, and obviously it's a very knee-jerk response to what I've gone through, and the meta hasn't even been close to settling, but, you know, it's content for content, so we'll talk about the first day impressions, and I'm going to go through the cards once again to talk about where I think where all of them land for Forest in general, and I'll keep it brief just because I talked about them once already, so we'll just try and skip through. So, day one analysis. I might put this part in the beginning of the video just to have like the actual beefy stuff in front. But basically, I think Carbuncle Roach is still tier 0. Despite the fact that Wardhaven absolutely decimates Roach. Like, Wardhaven kills every single version of Forest except for maybe Control Forest because of how it interacts with Rose Queen. Yeah, Wardhaven, I think, is my most attested deck, just because of how hard it counters Roach. And the worst part is that, like, it doesn't even counter other decks. Like, it might soft counter aggro, but aggro might just be able to cheese them. Like, proper aggro can maybe kill them before Aether and all that gets properly on board. But against stuff like Rune, like, against stuff like Portal, like, the wards are still scary, but those classes all have ways to deal with massive wards by cheesing out, like, effects like massive AoE in the case of Rune, Bane in case of Portal. Like, Dragon maybe has a bit tougher because they have to ramp properly, but they have Twilight Dragon to like randomly like murder all the minions occasionally, because I think some of the minions can actually go over 9 HP. And like, again, like Abyss has Medusa and other things to clear. So it just feels very distasteful that Cygames printed a deck archetype to literally just counter a single class. And that singular class, like, that just swings the matchup. I mean, to be fair, the matchup was like 90-10 in favor of Roach, but now the matchup's like 99-1 in favor of Haven, because you have to hope they just massively low roll. But even if they do low roll, you might not beat them in time, because they will eventually draw Aether if they're not completely low rolling. And because of how the deck works, like, they always have Salefa, they always have a million taunts. Like, you have to high roll as Forest. And even if you high roll as Forest, they have to also low roll as Wardhaven. So it's a very ugly matchup. It's kind of like paying for the sins of last expansion, but it is what it is. And then every other deck, I think Roach is tier 0, but I think if you appropriately like adjust all the power levels, it's actually probably more likely that there's a lot more tier 1 decks, and Carbuncle Roach is now tier 0.5, and there is no more true tier 0, because a lot of power levels of a lot of decks that Roach used to be, like, for example, Control Abyss, they now have way better plays and way better anti-Roach counterplay, to the point where while Roach does still beat them if they draw well, and it still does the usual shenanigans that they did before, if you don't draw into those shenanigans on time, now there's way more pressure by those decks. So, like, Abyss has that 9 mana card that drops a million taunts. Like, if you clear all the taunts but you can't clear that last minion's like a free 10, deal 10. And that's a 9 mana play. And in the past against Abyss, like, if the Abyss didn't high roll and you also didn't high roll, you could stall them out past turn 10 for a very long time. But now they draw this one card, and now you will lose the game if they draw that one card. And that makes the Roach matchup a lot more balanced out. Like, again, I think Roach is still favored, but a lot of decks now have that, where in the past where Roach could, like, they could stall, like, against Portal, turn 6-7, you could theoretically stall a little bit because they didn't have great plays there. But now they have Karula, and Karula accelerates Portal's turn 6 and 7 by a lot, because not only can Karula deal 2 damage through Super Evo, he can summon Beta, deal more damage, or Karula can just summon a random artifact that now also has random effects attached to it because of the new support they got. So generically, I think Roach is still definitely easily like top 2 decks in the game, but the difference between top 2 and the rest of the pack now is a lot smaller than it used to be. We have 4 categories, essentially. If the card doesn't show up in here, then just assume it's so bad that I forgot about it when I was organizing stuff. In the first category, we have something called Catered for Roach, and these are just 2 cards that they released called Ambush from Above and Fairy Fencer. Essentially, the reason why I think these 2 cards are catered for Roach is mainly just because they're very cheap and they help out Roach, like the Carbuncle style Roach, in a very efficient way. So obviously, Ambush from Above is a very cheap removal spell, and it helps against, you know, certain ward spells. Like, something like Wardhaven won't be fixed by Ambush from Above, but at least you can pretend that you're doing a bit better against Ambush Haven because of Ambush from above. From my bad, Ward Haven because of the spell. And again, it's just really useful against certain wide decks, like against aggro. Ambush from above is really efficient against decks that have really fat minions. You can use a fairy or two with Ambush from above to clear that. It's just very good. And then Fairy Fencer is just a very decent body. I thought it was gonna be worse than it actually was because I thought Fairy Tamer was just a better 2-cost drop to play. But after playing Fairy Fencer a lot, it feels really nice to drop it on turn 2. And obviously you might miss out on certain combo pieces later on, but having a 2-2 body is really valuable, especially when you're playing against Rune and stuff, because you get to scratch them down that much faster. And against aggro, you just get to trade into minions without having to take the extra like 2 damage from a 2-2 being on board. Now you can actually trade into the 2-2 and clear it instead of needing to play fairies later on. So you essentially trade the fairy body from Fairy Tamer, and instead you combine it into the minion itself, and it is cheaper in that way, but again, you do lose the combo potential from it. So these are the only 2 cards I think were a very strong addition. The issue is that it's very catered for Carbuncle, or just I guess Roach in general would want to play it, but it's very catered towards an existing playstyle, which is kind of boring, and that's going to be what I'm going to talk about. That's going to be like the general theme of the rest of the cards that I'm going to talk about. So these cards are going to be the cards that are great, but they aren't actually strong enough to actually merit like a new deck based around them. In fact, they're not even strong enough to necessarily be played in the existing Carbuncle deck because they're just alright. The first card is going to be Cynthia. Cynthia is essentially Forest Zirconia, and on paper, Forest Zirconia should be really broken. The issue is that unlike Sword rather, Forest doesn't have enough great power plays after Cynthia. They have a lot of good combo potential and a lot of good like control, but Forest, again, like Sword, when they play the Zirconia, you expect them to play into stuff like Luminous Magus, into Amelia or Dogs, into 7-drop, into like Geno, into Amalia. Like you expect them to have a powerful play every single turn, and Zirconia is kind of the start of those powerful plays to force you to have answers over and over again. With Cynthia, she is still a very good tempo card, but once you kill one Cynthia, you're not really scared of the rest that's coming out afterwards. Like you're like, oh crap, Cynthia, like I have to deal with that. And then you kill Cynthia, and then you're not really scared of the fact that you can't clear Forest's future boards. You just have to deal with the annoyance of that one annoying board post Cynthia. And since she is quite expensive, she doesn't really contribute to combo play, and she's not strong enough by herself to clear the really fat, massive boards that are problematic, like Kuon, like Cerberus. Like she's good for the mid game, but she's not good enough early game or late game. And that, or rather, she's good early game for turn 4 and turn 5, but she's not good past turn 6. She's not good on like turn 10. She's all right if you have Arya, but then you're dealing with like really conditional draw orders that are really difficult to run into from my experience. I played like 5 games of a very focused deck, and I could never get Cynthia after Arya with an Evo to deal with damage that like you're kind of promised by playing Cynthia in an Arya based deck. Titania is a card that seems like she should be auto-included in Forest, or in like even in Carbuncle Forest. The issue with Titania is that what ends up happening is that you're constantly like, if you play Titania in Carbuncle, then you're always to play Garden, and you'll notice that I don't have Garden in the first 2 categories. So I rate Garden very low compared to what a lot of people would probably rate it. And if you play Titania, you're kind of forced to play Garden because your hand is just too cluttered with stuff. So in a fairy focused deck where you're playing stuff like Cynthia, you're playing stuff like Arya, Titania is actually very good because that means you can play fairies as needed, and you're never going to run out of fairies in the long run. You might run out of like excessive fairies, but you always have some fairies to use. And with that style, you're always dumping your hand because you're required to clear the board, and you're not really obligated to keep cards in your hand because you're just assuming that the fairy generation long term will slowly eke out a win. The issue is that doesn't really work because fairies themselves aren't strong enough to hard force enough value or even provide enough pressure in the long run to actually close a game out. You're still relying on Roach to win games, even in a fairy focused deck, which means that Titania herself isn't really that good. And in Carbuncle decks, your goal, especially in this meta, is to kill your opponent by like turn 10. And of course, as the game goes beyond turn 10, Titania will technically have generated more value overall. But then with Titania, again, you're dealing with like bad hand space, you're dealing with technically worse tempo because Titania herself is not a good tempo play, and you have to deal with like way more awkward scenarios where you're like, okay, I have to burn cards inefficiently because I need to draw into my Roach that I haven't drawn yet in 20 cards, but because I have 8 cards, I'm drawing a card from Godwood and a fairy from Titania, and an extra turn, and my natural card draw, which means that every turn I have to drop the 6 cards in hand, or else I burn the next card. And if I burn Roach, then the game's over. So that's kind of the issue with Titania. Like, she is good in a fairy deck, but she's not that great in a carbuncle deck unless the scenario is like, unless the stars align. Like unless you have a bad hand where you don't have excessive, or let's say you have a perfect hand where you don't have excessive draw, you don't have excessive fairy generation, and you're able to keep your hand down to like 6 cards per game or per turn. Titania is really good, but the issue is that you don't often get the privilege of ending a turn with 6 cards in your hand very often. So at most you play one Titania, which is why she's in great but not actually that strong, because she's not strong enough to define a deck type. She's not strong enough to be played every single game, but she is good enough that if the stars align, she is extremely powerful. But because that's very rare, you don't want to play her that often or even see her that often. Lamaga is honestly quite good, but the issue with Lamaga is that her optimal scenario is not very frequent, and because of how decks work in this current meta, being good in being very good in optimal scenarios, but being bad in every other scenario is not good enough for a card. What I'm talking about is essentially that Lamaga's maximum value is when your opponent plays 3 units with more than 6 HP, because that way Lamaga's Super Evolve can tick all 3 times, which will deal 6 damage in total, and then Lamaga herself can swing into it can swing into a minion and deal out 1 damage. So in her ideal scenario, Lamaga is a delayed board wipe that prevents your opponent from maximizing the board space and deals 7 damage over 3 turns or over 2 turns, which is very, very powerful. There's no denying that. The issue is that because of how Shadowverse works, usually at most, what the most people will play is like 2 or 3 cards, and Lamaga will almost always be trained with a really big card, and the other Fanfare and Super Evolve effect will probably just ping off like a very small token. So you're not getting the 7 damage peak. You're more likely to not getting like a 3 or 4 damage with the board control aspect, which isn't terrible, but because of how much control Forest has, you don't need Lamaga to deal with like 2 big minions and a small minion. You don't need Lamaga to deal with 1 big minion and 2 small minions. You have so many answers for those already, and Lamaga needs to Super Evolve to actually deal with those minions anyways. So once again, the options you already have already deal with those board states that Lamaga would otherwise be mediocre into with the Super Evolve. So she again falls into a scenario where she is really great when she works really well, but she's not strong enough to define an archetype, and she's not strong enough to be played every single game. And I think, in my opinion, like, she is kind of like an Olivia, where Olivia cycles your deck obviously and heals you and does a lot of things, and Olivia is also technically 5 mana because of her mana refund, but Lamaga is theoretically more damage if you ignore the fact that Olivia can Super Evo an existing minion, and Lamaga is also a way scarier body than Olivia. But the issue is again that like you have to burn a Super Evo on her, and if you're playing Carbuncle, that means you only have 1 Super Evo for Carbuncle Super Evo, and if you're playing Carbuncle, you already have Glade and Lily, so you already have that Super Evo target, and playing Glade and Lily also draws you cards, so Lamaga is weaker in that scenario as well. So again, she is really strong in her optimal scenario. Like if you ever went to a deck, or if you high roll Lamaga, let's say that like turn 7 you Super Evo, turn 8 you Super Evo, you can easily deal like 14 damage in her highest peak with like a bunch of upsides. So her highest peak is very good, but it's very rare. So that's why she's great but not good. The next deck, I basically have 2 cards in here. These are basically cards that you could play in Forest, but I wouldn't say are optimal by any means. Garden Allure is probably the hottest take here, just because I think a lot of people overhype Garden's Allure to say like, oh, this is a very strong card because it solves your handbrake problem. The issue is that the handbrake problem, while it was a big deal, it wasn't very frequent, and also when you play Garden's Allure, you're assuming that you're going to draw it in time, like for like the scenario where you do handbrake. Now, there is a point to be made where like, oh, draw 2 for 2 is never going to be bad, but you have to remember that this card, in order to draw 2, is chomping one of your real cards. So this card isn't actually going card positive, this card is actually going card neutral, depending on how many fuses you have. So in my head, the reason why I think this card is bad is because I don't want to play bad cards or mediocre cards in my deck to the point where Garden's Allure is always going to be good. So, I mean, I guess in this scenario, I'm trying to be competitive, because if you're playing Fairy Forest, then you always have quote unquote mediocre cards because of the dupe Arya and the dupe Titania. In which case, Guardian's Alert is totally fine because of the hand space. But if I'm playing Carbuncle, Carbuncle has enough support now to be almost completely optimized. So why am I playing Guardian's Alert to eat my good cards that I might need later on, and also just make my deck worse because I have another bad quote unquote bad card in my deck, if that makes sense. So I think Guardian's Alert is vastly overrated for very specifically Carbuncle Forest, and for every other forest list that is prone to maybe getting bad draw and also prone to having mediocre cards. Guardian Alert is fine. I wouldn't play three cards in that. I wouldn't play three Guardians Alerts in that scenario because Guardian Alert is ironically very slow as a draw card, especially in, again, cases where you're probably playing like turn 8s into fat boards. It's not doing much for you because it eats your combo. Like, it does provide combo, but it eats your mana, and a lot of very efficient, or like a lot of like desperate board clears by Forest requires all the mana you can have, and Guardian's Allure being 2 mana like kind of hinders that, the feasibility of clearing everything. So the card is all right when it works, but when it doesn't work, it just kind of sits there. And then obviously draw is always gonna be good, but as a Forest player, you always want to either already have the draw, and you already have the draw through Glade, Lily, and Godwood, or Guardians Alert is kind of like I just need it. It's like a Hail Mary play, like, I hope that I draw into the ideal cards that will help me out and get through, which isn't gonna happen that often. Odin, I only put in here because Odin is literally just a better Selwyn. Unlike Selwyn, you don't need a Super Evo Odin to get the effect, and he does the exact same amount of damage. Selwyn obviously has more HP, so theoretically Selwyn is better post Super Evo when like he's just a body, but like, why would you return a card to hand when you can just banish it? Especially when there's like cards like Willy and cards that do have like very nasty death rattle effects. Like, just generically, like, Odin power creeps Selwyn, which is fine because Selwyn isn't a legendary, but it's ironic because Odin is a neutral card. So the fact that like Selwyn was just completely overshadowed by Odin, and Selwyn was being played last set, that means Odin is okay, but Selwyn was already being phased out by a lot of other cards to begin with. So that's why I have Odin as like, he's alright, but he's not like super necessary, just like how Selwyn wasn't super necessary. And then the 4 fun cards are just going to be cards that I talked about like last time, where these enable a different archetype, but you'll never actually play it in a proper Roach deck. So Grimnir is just a very neutral ward. He is going to be okay against Sword. Like, if you're playing Control Forest, having Grimnir is going to be alright, because that means that later on, like against Forest that has a lot of tokens, against some other classes that have decent tokens, you might be able to like ping them down to 2 HP and then clear, and then you also get to clear all the trash around it. So he doesn't really do much for Forest. He just provides more control. But if you're playing Control Forest, then you want this. Like, let's say that you're playing Rose Queen and you have a Grimir crest. You can now Super Evo Rose Queen and clear a wider board because of Grimnir. So that might actually help out with Control Forest later on. Wildheart, she's okay. She's not that good. She's a very decent minion on 3. But the issue is that decent minions in Shadowverse just are not good enough. So if you get her in her ideal scenario, she's fine, which is like turn 3 whack. But she's not better than Amataz in that scenario. Like, Amataz will simply win you games. Wildheart will not. And Amataz has the upside, especially with Titania existing now, where he is somewhat useful later on because when you Evo Amataz, he does technically do removal. And then he also gets rushed with that. So Wildheart is like technically a very strong turn 3 tempo play, but Forest doesn't really care about tempo, and Wildheart later on isn't strong enough to warrant being played as like spot removal regardless. Dwarven Mallet Man is interesting because he is theoretically very strong. He is a board-wide 4 damage AoE at like 6 or 7 mana, depending on whether or not you have 0 costs. The issue is that without that combo, he is essentially Bale. And why would you, like, and you don't really play Bale at 5 mana. Like, you would rather never want to play Bale at 5 mana unless you're desperate. So this is a 7 mana board wipe essentially with like 2 fairies. What he is at 7 mana is that it's like deal 2 to enemy targets and deal 4 to enemy board. It's like 7/7 essentially. So a 7/7 deal for board wide is honestly not bad. And it will help against like Aether Ward, just like thin out their board a little bit. And that's not even, like, that's pretty good. Like, I can't deny that. That's pretty good. But the issue is that it's not usable for Carbuncle Roach or even Roach in general. So he falls into a deck archetype that doesn't exist for Force properly yet. And then Lionel. Lionel is ironically, like, pretty powerful as a tempo play. He does require a super evo to reach his max potential, which is why he's probably not as good as he could be. Like if Lionel had like was 7 mana with slightly better effects, then he'd be absurdly strong. But as a 6 mana, he doesn't have access to super evo for the Baby Carbuncle. And if you guys don't know what Baby Carbuncle does, somehow when you super evo it, it recovers 3 play points. So ironically, Lionel ends up being a 3 mana 12/12. Is it 12/12? It's a 3 mana. I can't do math. It's 2/2 bodies. Yeah, 3 mana 13/13 with a 5/5 rush or with a 5/5 super evo. So that's honestly quite good on 6 mana. But the issue is that you have to go second to play him on 6 mana. And if you're going first or playing on 7 mana, then you're dealing with like even more powerful cards like Kuan, Olivia, or Kuan Orcus like Garyu. So Lionel is essentially our version of those massive body cards, and he's alright in that case. Like he again, 3 mana, like you play him, you super evo Carbuncle, and you can play a combo or even more stuff attached to it. And that's really powerful. But he requires a super evo, and again with Grimnir, that is very efficient. But then you need more after Lionel, which Forest doesn't have. I mean, I guess saying that, like, Force does kind of have that. Woodwalkers is just a worse Lionel for the most part, because you do have to evo the Gentle Treants in order to get the rush, or to get the strike effect. I do wish that these Gentle Treants just like, I wish that this card gave all the Gentle Treants rush, because while that might be a little overtuned, it would actually make this card playable, because as it is right now, you have to save an evo for this Gentle Treant to actually get the raw value from it. And again, it's not terrible. Like, you super evo 1 Treant, you have 1/7/7 and 2 4/4s. That's not the worst thing. But again, when you compare to stuff like Orcus, like Kuon, like Garyu, like Ralmia, it's just not that powerful. If they had Rush, you can at least heal 3 and do a board clear, and I think that's actually fair for 7 mana, especially for Forest. But I guess that is kind of overtuned because the base unit is already a 4 mana 4/4. But again, without being able to rush immediately, you're playing 3 4/4s that are very easily killed by almost every class on with the Evo. So this card is like good after everyone's ran out of resources, but then you have to live until everyone's ran out of resources, which is kind of difficult against certain crafts. So yeah, I hope this video was a good ramble. Sorry for not having good editing, as always, but I'm one person. I don't have an editor. I don't have the time, or I don't have the desire nor time to like do proper like edits that are cool and stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll continue to post more videos, and I'll do a proper gameplay video later to like show off why Carbuncle Roach is still top tier and why Fairy Roach is like not nearly as good as that. So yeah. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time. Have a good day or night wherever you are, and talk to you later. Bye bye.